Hello, I'm Carlton Van Putten, founder and CEO of PayRent. Welcome to the Keys to Success podcast, where we unlock the secrets to smarter investments, smoother tenant management, and bigger profits, one episode at a time. Ready to master your property game? Let's dive in.
All right, so have you ever heard of getting free land? Like totally free, just by hanging out on it long enough.
Sounds a little too good to be true, right?
Right. But it's a real thing.
It is.
It's called adverse possession, and it's what we're diving into today.
That's right.
We've got your articles, your research, your notes, and we're going to break it all down, figure out how this actually works, the connection to squatters' rights, and some practical tips, whether you're trying to, protect what's yours, or maybe even stake a claim yourself.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. It's a concept that has been around for a really long time, actually. Goes back centuries to English common law.
Oh, wow.
The core idea is that land should be used productively. And so if a property owner is completely neglecting a piece of property, someone else who's actively using it could actually potentially gain ownership.
So it's not just like setting up a tent on an empty lot and being like, mine!
Right. Definitely not that simple. It's not about being sneaky or just occupying a space. There are specific legal requirements that have to be met.
So there are hoops to jump through.
Hoops to jump through, for sure. Yeah, imagine it like a checklist that you've got to complete.
Okay, what's the first box we need to check off on this list?
First one is continuous possession. And this means occupying the land without any significant breaks for a certain period of time. Now, that time frame, that can really vary a lot depending on where you are. We're talking anywhere from a few years to even decades in some places.
Decades. Wow, that's a long game. What else is on this checklist?
The next one is making your presence known. It's what's called open and notorious use.
Okay.
You can't be hiding in the shadows. Your use of the land has to be completely obvious. Anyone passing by should be able to see it, including the actual owner.
So no secret underground bunkers?
No secret bunkers, no. You've got to be out in the open acting like you own the place.
Gotcha.
And speaking of acting like the owner, the next requirement is exclusive possession. This means you're using the land as if you are the sole owner, not sharing it with anyone, not even the original owner. You're demonstrating that you're treating it as your own.
You're basically saying this is mine, not just by saying it, but by doing it.
Exactly, yeah. And the final piece of the puzzle is what's called adverse or hostile use. Now, this doesn't mean you have to be aggressive or start confrontations.
Right. No need to build barricades.
Real barricades, no. Hostile, in this context, simply means using the land in a way that goes against the owner's wishes or without their permission.
So, okay, let me just repeat this back to make sure I've got it. So, for adverse possession to actually work, you need to continuously and openly use the land exclusively and without the owner's permission, potentially for a really long time.
You got it. It's a high bar to clear, and that's intentional. The law doesn't make it easy to just claim someone else's property.
Well, this is all super interesting, but I have to admit, my mind is already going to those squatters' rights we hear about. I feel like that's got to be coming from a similar idea.
It does. Squatters' rights stem from this same principle of the land needing to be used productively. But as you can imagine, this whole concept gets pretty controversial.
Yeah, because on the one hand, you have people who might genuinely need housing and end up occupying a property that's just sitting there unused.
Right. And those who support squatters' rights often point out that it can offer some stability and shelter, especially in areas with limited housing options.
But then on the other hand, you've got property owners who, rightfully so, feel like their rights are being violated if someone just moves in without their permission. It is their property.
Absolutely. It's a very tricky situation. Legal frameworks try to find a balance, but it's definitely a topic that sparks a lot of debate and very strong opinions.
I can imagine. So let's get down to brass tacks here. Let's say our listener is dealing with squatters on their property. What's the first thing they should do?
Well, the most important thing is not to panic. And really, to avoid taking any action that could be considered harassment or an illegal eviction.
Right.
Because that could really backfire. Removing someone from your property illegally, that can be a really complicated process.
So no DIY eviction attempts, no matter how tempting it might be.
Right. Generally, the first step is to issue a formal notice to vacate. Give the squatters a specific time frame to leave. And this is usually determined by your local laws. If that doesn't work, then you may have to go through the courts, file a lawsuit for eviction.
Sounds like getting some legal counsel is probably a wise move at that point.
Yeah.
What about if someone is on the other side of this? So they're thinking about making an adverse possession claim.
Well, as we've discussed, meeting all of those legal requirements, it is a tall order. You need to have solid evidence to back up your claim. So this means documenting everything, dates you started using the land, photos, witness statements, anything and everything that proves you're meeting those criteria.
So you need like a detailed journal and a good camera.
Pretty much, yeah. And of course, legal advice is crucial here. A lawyer who specializes in real estate, they can guide you through the nuances of the process, the specific laws in your area, and make sure you're building a solid case. This is not something you want to try to handle on your own.
Got it, yeah. So what about protecting your property from these potential adverse possession claims in the first place? How do you even do that?
The key here is really being proactive. So regularly inspect and maintain your property.
Okay.
If it's well kept, if you're clearly using it, it's much harder for someone to try to come along and claim that you've been neglecting it.
So it's like you're just showing that you care about it and it's yours.
Exactly, yeah. It's like sending a clear message, this land is mine and I'm taking care of it. Visible boundaries are also your friend. So think fences, no trespassing signs, even natural barriers like hedges.
Right.
Those can really help to establish your ownership and make it a lot less appealing for someone to try and come in and stake a claim.
Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds like being a responsible landowner and understanding how all this works is like key in this whole adverse possession landscape.
Yeah.
Anything else that our listeners should keep in mind?
Yeah. I think one thing that's often overlooked is the power of a good relationship with your neighbors.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because they can act as your eyes and ears, especially when you're not around. They can alert you to any unusual activity on your property.
That's a really good point. Like a strong community can actually be a great defense against this.
Exactly.
Okay, before we move on, I want to touch on something that we haven't talked about directly. What are the consequences if you just completely ignore the possibility of adverse possession? Like, what's the worst case scenario here?
Well, I mean, the most significant risk, of course, is losing legal ownership of your property. If someone successfully checks all those boxes we talked about for adverse possession, you could find yourself in a situation where you no longer own that land, even if you've been paying taxes on it for years.
Wow, that is a scary thought. It really highlights how important it is to be proactive and informed about all this stuff.
Yeah.
But, I mean, beyond the legal aspects, there are some other potential headaches too, right?
Oh, absolutely. If someone's occupying your property without your permission, there's the risk of neglect or damage, which can lower your property value and lead to expensive repairs down the road. Plus, legal battles over property ownership, they're notoriously time-consuming and costly. They can really drain your resources and cause a lot of stress.
So burying your head in the sand is definitely not the way to go. Even if there's just a hint of an issue, it's better to be informed and get some legal advice. Always better to deal with these situations head on than wait for them to blow up into a major problem.
I wholeheartedly agree. Being proactive and informed is your best defense when it comes to protecting your property rights.
All right, well, that was a lot to absorb, but hopefully our listeners feeling a bit more savvy about this whole adverse possession thing.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We explored the legal requirements, we delved into that often controversial world of squatters' rights, and we even touched on the potential consequences of being caught off guard.
Yeah, and in the next part, we're going to dive into some real-world examples of how all of this actually plays out in different situations.
You look forward to it.
Yeah, so stay tuned for that.
So, before we move on, I think it's worth repeating that this adverse possession thing, it's not just about losing land.
Right.
It can also impact, your peace of mind, your financial well-being.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Dealing with legal disputes, potential property damage, man, that can be a huge drain on your time, energy, and your bank account.
Absolutely. Now, I know we've been digging into, the legal side of all this, but let's try to bring it to life a little bit, with a real-world scenario.
I love a good story. Give me an example.
Okay. All right. So picture this. There's a vacant lot in a neighborhood.
Okay.
It's been neglected for years. The owner lives far away, hardly ever visits.
All right.
Local resident, let's call her Sarah, starts tending a small garden on a corner of the lot.
Okay, I see where this is going. She's starting to act like she owns it.
Exactly. And let's say Sarah continues to use this part of the lot openly and exclusively for the next, say, 15 years.
Okay.
She even pays property taxes on that portion, keeps it well maintained.
Boy.
And everyone in the neighborhood, they recognize it as her garden.
So she is checking off all those boxes.
She is.
Continuous use, open and notorious, exclusive, paying taxes.
Yep.
What happens if the original owner suddenly shows up and is like, hey, I want that land back?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because Sarah could actually make a claim for adverse possession.
Really?
She'd need to prove to the court that she's met all those requirements.
Right.
But if she's been keeping good records, there's a chance she could legally become the owner.
Wow, that's kind of wild.
Yeah.
It's like the legal system is actually rewarding her for taking this neglected space and making it productive.
It kind of is, yeah. It highlights how the law can recognize that productive use as a factor.
Yeah, okay, so that's an example where it seems like it could work in someone's favor.
Yeah.
What about those times where it's more about like people taking advantage, like those squatter situations?
Right, okay, so let's flip the script.
Okay.
Imagine a homeowner goes on like a year-long trip overseas.
Okay.
And while they're away, a group of squatters move into their house.
Oh, no. That's a homeowner's worst nightmare.
It is. And if those squatters are trying to stay hidden, they're not meeting that open and notorious requirement.
Right.
But what if they start to get a little bolder?
Uh-oh.
They start making changes to the property, maybe even try to pay property taxes in their names.
That sounds like they could maybe have a case, even though it's like totally unethical.
Yeah, it really highlights why homeowners need to protect themselves.
Right, which is where all that advice comes in.
Yeah.
Regular inspections, even when you're away, clear boundaries, no trespassing signs.
Exactly. It's all about sending that message that you're actively managing your property.
Not giving anyone an opening.
Not giving anyone an opening. And remember, local laws can be really different.
Right.
So it's important to know the regulations in your specific area.
Yeah, I mean, this is where having a good lawyer on your side can be super helpful.
Absolutely.
You know, speaking of real-life situations, I'm curious, have there been any famous cases or, like, particularly interesting adverse possession situations?
Oh, absolutely. Adverse possession cases, they often make headlines.
Yeah.
Because, they involve really unique circumstances, and they raise a lot of interesting questions, legally. One that comes to mind is it involved a boundary dispute between two neighbors.
Oh, neighbor disputes, those are always fun.
They are.
Tell me more.
So these two neighbors, they had lived next to each other for decades.
Okay.
Their properties were just separated by a simple fence. But over the years, one neighbor, let's call him Mr. Jones, he starts to gradually extend his garden beyond the fence line.
Okay.
Adds flowers, shrubs, even plants a few small trees.
So he was slowly, like, taking over a chunk of his neighbor's property.
He was. It was a bold move.
Yeah.
And the other neighbor, Mrs. Smith, she didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't mind.
Or maybe she wasn't paying close attention.
Yeah, maybe not. So Mr. Jones, he was getting away with it.
For a while.
But then Mrs. Smith decided to sell her property.
Oh, boy.
And during the survey, the potential buyers discovered that a portion of what they thought was her land was actually being used by Mr. Jones.
Uh-oh. Sounds like that's going to cause some problems.
Yeah, you can say that. Mr. Jones, having enjoyed using that extra land for so long, he decided to make a claim for adverse possession.
Wow. Yeah.
He argued that he had been using it openly and continuously for over 20 years.
Wow.
Which was well past the legal time limit in their state.
So it went to court.
It did.
Who won?
Mr. Jones actually won.
Wow, really?
Yeah, the judge ruled that he had met all the requirements, and so he was granted ownership of that disputed land.
Wow, what a victory for Mr. Jones. But I bet Mrs. Smith and those potential buyers were not happy.
I'm sure they were not. It's a really good reminder to know your property boundaries and deal with any issues early.
Right. Could have saved a lot of headaches.
Absolutely. This case shows how adverse possession can have really big consequences, sometimes with surprising outcomes.
Yeah. It's like a real-life game of Monopoly, but with much higher stakes.
Definitely.
So we talked about the legal stuff, the practical advice, some real-world examples. Now let's talk about the ethical side of adverse possession.
Okay.
Because I don't know about you, but this whole thing can feel a bit morally gray, right?
It can. It definitely can. Adverse possession is basically saying it's okay to take something that doesn't belong to you,
Right.
even if you're doing it out in the open.
Yeah.
So it raises all these questions about fairness, property rights, and what it means to be a responsible landowner.
Yeah, on the one hand, you could say, well, land shouldn't be left unused if someone's willing to put in the effort to make it productive.
Right.
Maybe they deserve to be the owner.
That's sort of the utilitarian perspective, right?
Okay.
Like making the best use of resources for society as a whole.
Yeah.
It's definitely a compelling argument, especially in cases where property has been abandoned or forgotten.
Yeah.
But then on the other side of the coin, you've got this idea that, no, property rights are fundamental.
Right.
No one should be able to just come and take something that belongs to someone else, no matter how they're using it.
Yeah.
That's more of a deontological view.
Okay.
Right? It focuses on the principles of right and wrong, regardless of the outcome.
Right.
It's a powerful argument, too. I mean, we have laws to protect private property for a reason.
So how do you reconcile those two? And they seem like opposite viewpoints.
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The law tries to strike a balance, but setting those requirements we talked about.
Right.
Making sure it's not just a free-for-all.
Right. Yeah.
But whether it's ethical, that's a debate that's still going on.
It's complicated. There are no easy answers. And, I think it's important to remember that there's a human side to this.
Absolutely.
I mean, adverse possession can have a huge emotional impact on both sides.
Yeah.
I mean, for someone who loses their property, it can feel like a huge injustice,
Right.
a violation of their rights. But then for the person who gains the property, that could be a mix of emotions too, right?
Definitely. Elation at becoming the owner, but maybe some guilt,
Yeah.
maybe some uncertainty about how it all happened.
It's not just a legal thing. It's like a human story, right?
Absolutely. Real emotions, real consequences.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what makes it so fascinating to explore,
I agree. It really makes you think about our ideas about ownership, responsibility,
what it means to use land in a good way.
Exactly.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
Explored the ins and outs of adverse possession, the controversies, the squatters' rights, real-life examples, even the ethical stuff.
It's been quite a journey.
But before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked about how adverse possession can reward what's considered productive use of land.
Right.
But it also brings up this bigger question. What is productive use?
That's a great point.
Yeah, it can be interpreted in so many ways, right?
Yeah.
Is it just about economics? Or does it include, social, environmental, aesthetic value?
Right. Like, does a beautifully kept garden have the same weight as, a big commercial development?
Right. Or what about a community space created on a neglected lot?
These are really good questions.
Yeah, they kind of go beyond that legal definition.
They do.
And I think it challenges us to think about our values.
Absolutely. How do we define responsible land use?
What does it mean to use the land for good?
Right.
Yeah, that's something that could really spark some lively discussions. And I hope our listeners continue to think about it.
Me too.
But for now, let's move on to the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll wrap up this exploration of adverse possession.
Sounds good.
Leave you with some final thoughts. All right, so welcome back to our deep dive into adverse possession.
It's been a fascinating one for sure.
It has. We've talked about the legal side of things, the ethical questions, even some real-life drama.
Oh, yeah. Neighbor disputes.
Exactly.
Never a dull moment.
But before we wrap up, I kind of want to zoom out a little bit
Okay, yeah.
and look at the bigger picture here.
Sounds good.
Because I think adverse possession, with all its little quirks, really reflects this fundamental tension in how we see land ownership.
It does, yeah. Is it just about having that piece of paper, the deed? Or does the way the land's actually being used matter?
We've been dancing around this idea throughout our conversation.
Yeah.
But it's worth highlighting. Adverse possession forces us to really think about what defines ownership and what responsibilities come with it.
It does. On one hand, we have this traditional view, right? Property ownership, it's absolute.
So you got the deed. It's yours, period.
Exactly. But then adverse possession comes in and says, well, hold on a second. What if you're not doing anything with that land?
Right. What if you're neglecting it, abandoning it?
Your claim might not be so strong after all.
It's like use it or lose it, but with, way higher stakes.
Exactly. And this isn't just some legal loophole.
Yeah.
It's part of a bigger conversation about land use, resources, even our connection to the environment.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
We're facing these huge challenges like climate change, cities growing like crazy, how to feed everyone.
Right.
The way we use land is more important than ever.
It is. And adverse possession, even though it often boils down to these individual disputes,
Yeah.
it can actually make us think about these big issues.
Yeah. So are we supporting those who are using the land, to grow food, to create green spaces, build homes?
Even if they don't have that traditional ownership.
Even if they don't. Or Do we protect the rights of those property owners no matter what?
It's a tough question.
It is. It's a real balancing act.
It is. There's no easy answer. But the fact that we're even having this conversation, that's what matters.
Right. It shows that this stuff is important.
Yeah. Adverse possession makes us confront these ideas about ownership.
Whether the systems we have, are really working for us.
In the 21st century, that's right.
It reminds us that the law isn't static.
Right.
It changes and adapts.
With society.
As our relationship with land keeps changing.
Yeah.
I think we can expect adverse possession to keep changing right along with it.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
yeah,
I want to leave you with this thought. Next time you walk by, like an empty lot, a neglected garden,
yeah,
maybe even see a neighborly feud over a fence line.
Uh-huh.
Think about the stories behind those spaces.
Think about the history.
The claims, the potential.
The possibility.
And who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe it'll spark your own curiosity about this whole world of adverse possession.
The world of property law.
Because as we've learned,
Not if we learn.
sometimes the most unexpected paths can lead to the most fascinating discoveries.
That's the truth. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into adverse possession.
We hope you found it insightful.
And maybe a little thought-provoking.
Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep learning.
And keep those property lines in check.
That's good advice.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Keys to Success. I invite you to check out past episodes and follow us on your favorite podcast platform to get notified when new ones are released. And when you're ready to simplify managing your properties, be sure to visit us at www.payrent.com.